Welcome to Understanding Wildfire with Professor Monks. Today's topic, fire in the Global South. So far, we've mostly been talking about wildfire that happens in highly industrialized temperate zone regions like the United States and Australia. In this video, we're going to examine how fire issues play out differently in other parts of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest or Indonesia. This video is titled Fire in the Global South. Global South is one of several terms used to refer to the poorer nations of the world. You may be more familiar with terms like developing countries, the third world, the periphery of the global economy. We're using the term Global South because it's relatively neutral, even though it's somewhat inaccurate since Australia is even further south. The areas of the world that we're interested in for this video have two characteristics in common which shape their experience with fire. First, they're located in tropical and subtropical areas close to the equator. And second, they have lower levels of wealth. Tropical and subtropical zones have distinctive climate patterns. If you envision a place near the equator, what probably comes to mind is a rainforest, an area with profuse plant growth and frequent precipitation. This is because the sun's rays are most intense near the equator, because they come straight down overhead. This heats the air and causes it to rise, bringing with it water vapor that evaporated from oceans and rivers. As the air rises, it cools off. Cool air can't hold as much moisture, so it falls back down as rain. This phenomenon of rising air and heavy rain is known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ. We've established that moisture inhibits fire. Therefore, tropical rainforests that grow near the equator very rarely experience natural fires. Plants and animals that live there have few, if any, adaptations to fire, and may in fact be extremely vulnerable to fire. To the north and south of the tropical zone, we find the subtropical zone. The subtropical zone is characterized by a wet, dry climate pattern. This is because the intertropical convergence zone shifts with the seasons. The Earth's tilt points a different part of the Earth toward the sun at different times of the year, and so the ITCZ moves towards whichever hemisphere is having its summer and away from the hemisphere having its winter. This means that in July and August, the ITCZ is located to the north of the equator, and in December and January, it's located to the south. So subtropical areas experience heavy rains during the summer and dry conditions in the winter. Subtropical zones are commonly savannas, grasslands dotted with trees. The wet-dry climate pattern is optimal for fire. The wet season provides moisture to enable plants to grow, providing lots of fuel. Then the dry season comes along and dries everything out, enabling fires to burn. When we look at maps of global fire activity, we see hardly any fire in the tropical zone or the subtropical zone that's having its summer. Having winter, we see lots of fire. Many subtropical areas burn as often as every year, with low-intensity surface fires consuming the grasses and leaving fully grown trees untouched. These fires may be started by lightning or lit by people. Farmers in these areas commonly burn their fields to clear stubble, eliminate pests, and fertilize the soil. Pastoralists, that is, people who make their living by raising livestock like cattle, also burn pastures to encourage new growth for their animals to eat. Overall, these subtropical savanna zones are usually much more densely populated than tropical forests. Moving on to the second characteristic of the places we're examining, the question of why some parts of the world are rich and others are poor is one that has interested social scientists for centuries. Among the many theories that have been proposed, the one that's most significant in this context is the history of colonialism. Colonialism is the practice of conquering foreign lands and turning them into colonies. A colony serves to produce goods and generate revenue that enriches the colonizer country. While many societies throughout history have engaged in colonialism, the most extensive colonialism that was carried out by European countries like Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and Britain beginning around 1500. European colonialism reshaped the entire world, and its legacy remains important today. The USA and Australia were what were referred to as settler colonies. That means that large numbers of Europeans moved to these colonies, and both countries now have majority white populations. These countries became neo-Europes, and even gained colonial possessions of their own, such as US rule over Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Most of the Global South, by contrast, was subjected to extractive colonialism. While some Europeans moved to these areas in over-to-oversea operations, the population was largely made up of the indigenous population and enslaved workers brought in to work on plantations. the goal of an extractive colony is to generate wealth for the colonial rulers. Some areas were mining colonies producing silver, copper, diamonds, and other valuable minerals. Others were plantation colonies, growing crops like sugarcane or tobacco on a massive scale. Timber was also an important colonial product. Extractive colonialism enriched the colonizer country while impoverishing the colony. So it's no wonder that colonies fought by a variety of means to achieve independence. But even formal political independence did not end the colonial economic relationship. Former colonies had the infrastructure to continue producing the products they'd provided as colonies, but lacked things like factories and banks. So they remained economically dependent on and subservient to the former colonizers. On top of this, leaders of these former colonies often took out large loans from abroad to help promote their country's economic development, but in doing so, often ended up deeply in debt. These countries are seeking ways to grow their economies, and one way to do that is to increase their exploitation of their natural resources. Tropical forests are tempting development zones as they contain lots of valuable timber as well as land that can be farmed or used for raising livestock. And so we often see a push to develop these tropical lands. We can think of this as a kind of internal colonialism, treating their own tropical lands as a colony to exploit for the benefit of the dominant parts of the country. Sometimes that push for development is a bottom-up phenomenon, with poor people seeking a better life by moving out to the tropical frontier zone. Other times, the government enacts resettlement schemes. For example, Indonesia has sponsored the movement of large numbers of people from the densely populated island of Java to more sparsely populated islands like Borneo. Large corporations also get involved in development of tropical forests and extraction of their resources. This could include international logging companies, as well as farms producing palm oil, soybeans, or beef. In either case, these newcomers often end up in conflict with the indigenous residents of the area, who did not agree to have their lands given away or developed. So what does this all have to do with fire? Well, these development activities introduce fire into tropical forest ecosystems that are not well adapted to it. Farming often includes burning the plants that were cut down to clear the land. More human presence creates more opportunities for ignitions from cigarettes or vehicles. And perhaps most importantly, the forest canopy is broken up by clearing land for farms, extracting timber, and building roads. This allows sunlight to get down into the lower parts of the forest, drying it out. The dried out forest is then much easier to burn. Once fire has taken hold in a tropical forest area, it can be very difficult to reestablish the original fire-sensitive vegetation. Once an area has burned, quick-growing invasive species can move in. These species, in turn, raise the risk of further fires, which will again kill off rainforest species and favor the invasives. One example is a grass ylang-ylang, scientific name Imperata cylindrica. It's expanding its range in Indonesia because it grows quickly after a fire. The mature grass is, like a eucalyptus tree, extremely flammable. That means an area where ylang-ylang grows will likely exhibit a high-frequency fire regime on the order of once every few years. This prevents slow-growing rainforest trees from maturing, locking the area into a new ecosystem with a new fire regime. Consider the case of the Amazon in Brazil. The southern part of the Amazon is in the subtropical wet-dry climate zone, so it's normal to have lots of fires there every August, winter or dry season in the southern hemisphere. But in 2019, the world's attention was drawn to the fact that much more burning was occurring than usual, and that burning was encroaching on areas that were normally rainforests that remained wet all year. The underlying cause was development policies put in place by Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was outspoken about his desire to boost Brazil's economy by developing the Amazon. He denounced both indigenous people and environmentalists who sought to protect the forest. He authorized expanded farming, logging, and mining in the region, and cut back enforcement against illegal deforestation. This development opened the door to destructive fires. It's interesting to note that a similar increase in burning happened in neighboring areas of Bolivia, where the rainforest development was also being encouraged by then-President Evo Morales. Morales is on the far left of the political spectrum, whereas Bolsonaro is an extreme right-winger, showing that a variety of leaders of countries in the global south can find themselves implementing development policies based on exploiting tropical forest resources.